I am Harrison Caldwell, 70 years old, and somehow still processing the profound betrayal my own family inflicted upon me. As a successful civil engineer who spent decades building infrastructure across the country, I had long ago escaped the poverty of my youth, only to find myself trapped in a different kind of misery. Last weekend, my wife's family held their annual summer reunion at our home to celebrate the season. Between the grilled steaks and the expensive champagne that I had paid for, my wife's niece deliberately bumped into me, spilling red wine all over my shirt. She leaned forward and smirked. "You know, Harrison, you are lucky we even tolerate your outdated planet-ruining presence here. Pity goes a long way." I simply wiped the wine from my chest, looked at my wife, who refused to defend me, and smiled. That night, I bought a one-way ticket, logged into my computer, disabled every family credit card, and emailed my lawyer about freezing my entire estate. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth and treated you like a walking ATM. The air in the affluent suburb just outside of Boston was thick with the smell of expensive barbecue smoke and the hollow, echoing sound of forced laughter. It was a picturesque Saturday afternoon in mid-July. The sprawling backyard of the estate that my blood, sweat, and decades of relentless labor had purchased was currently swarming with dozens of my wife Cynthia's relatives. They were lounging on the custom mahogany deck I had designed, swimming in the heated infinity pool I had paid to install, and drinking vintage wine from my personal cellar. I stood near the edge of the patio, holding a simple glass of sparkling water, observing the sea of people who felt entirely entitled to the fruits of my labor. I had spent 45 years of my life as a civil engineer. I spent my youth and my middle age standing on freezing construction sites, managing massive infrastructure projects, pouring concrete building bridges, and enduring grueling hours so that my family would never have to know the financial panic I grew up with. But looking around that yard, I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. My niece-in-law, Morgan, was holding court near the outdoor kitchen. She was 28 years old, a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life, possessing a degree in a vague humanities field from an Ivy League university that I had entirely funded. She carried herself with an unbearable arrogance, constantly preaching about modern social awareness, while happily living off the wealth generated by the very industries she claimed to despise. I began to walk toward the kitchen to grab a napkin, keeping to myself as I usually did during these gatherings. That was when Morgan saw me coming. She deliberately shifted her weight, stepping directly into my path, with a full, oversized glass of dark red wine in her hand. The collision was not an accident. I felt the cold splash of the liquid before I even registered the impact. The dark red stain rapidly spread across the chest of my crisp white dress shirt, soaking through to my skin. I stopped, stunned by the sheer audacity of the action. Morgan did not gasp. She did not reach for a towel. Instead, she stood perfectly still, looking me up and down with a twisted, condescending smirk on her face. She raised her chin and, loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear, delivered her verdict. "Watch where you are going, Harrison." But then again, I guess a dinosaur who spent his whole life pouring toxic concrete and ruining the planet for the rest of us is used to leaving a mess wherever he goes. The entire backyard went dead silent. The clinking of glasses stopped. The quiet jazz music playing from the outdoor speakers suddenly seemed deafening. Dozens of eyes turned to look at me. I stood there, a 70-year-old man dripping with wine in my own backyard, publicly humiliated by a young woman whose luxurious life was entirely subsidized by my bank accounts. I slowly turned my head to look for Cynthia. My wife of 38 years was standing only a few feet away, holding a plate of appetizers. I looked into her eyes, fully expecting her to step forward, to reprimand her niece, to show even a fraction of loyalty to the man who had provided her with an incredibly comfortable life. Instead, Cynthia rolled her eyes. She let out a loud theatrical sigh, acting as though my ruined shirt and the sudden awkward silence were somehow my fault, an inconvenience to her perfect party. I took a deep breath, fighting the sudden violent urge to scream. I looked back at Morgan, my voice low but carrying the heavy weight of absolute authority. "I think you owe me an apology, Morgan." That was deliberate, and it was entirely disrespectful. Morgan immediately shifted gears. The arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by the trembling lower lip of a professional victim. She took a step back, clutching her empty wineglass to her chest, as if I had just threatened her physically. "Oh my God," she gasped, forcing tears into her eyes. "Why are you being so aggressive? I just bumped into you by accident. You always have to make everything so hostile. You always try to make my family feel small just because you have money." Before I could even process the sheer absurdity of her manipulation, a hand clamped down hard on my forearm. It was Cynthia. Her grip was tight, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. Her face was flushed with anger, but not at Morgan. She pulled me roughly away from the patio, dragging me toward the sliding glass doors and into the quiet, air-conditioned hallway of our home. As soon as the door slid shut behind us, cutting off the murmurs of her family, she turned on me with a ferocity that chilled me to the bone. "What is wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with barely contained rage. "You are embarrassing my family in front of everyone." I stared at her, genuinely bewildered. "I am embarrassing your family. Cynthia, your niece just deliberately threw a glass of wine on me and insulted my entire life's work. My work, I might add, that paid for the very ground she is standing on." Cynthia waved her hand dismissively, brushing away my words as if they were annoying insects. "Oh, please, Harrison, stop being so dramatic. Morgan is just passionate about the environment. She is young and outspoken. You always have to escalate things. You are making a scene over a stupid shirt." "It is not about the shirt, Cynthia. It is about respect. In my own home." "This is my home too," she snapped back, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "And these are my guests. I am not going to let your grumpy, miserable retirement attitude ruin this reunion. I am sick and tired of making excuses for your behavior. You have two options right now, Harrison. You either walk back out there, smile, and apologize to Morgan for raising your voice and acting aggressively, or you leave. Get out of my sight until you can learn how to treat my family properly." The silence that followed her ultimatum was absolute. I looked at the woman standing in front of me. I looked at the fine lines around her eyes, the expensive diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, the custom-tailored dress she wore. I had bought all of it. I had spent almost 4 decades working myself to the bone to ensure she never had to worry about a single bill, a single mortgage payment, or a single medical expense. I had given her a life of pure privilege. And in return, when her spoiled niece humiliated me in public, she demanded that I apologize for being the victim. Something inside me snapped, but it did not make a loud noise. It was a quiet, profound breaking. It was the sound of a heavy chain finally snapping after years of tension. The illusion of my marriage dissolved in that hallway. I saw her clearly for the first time in 38 years. She did not love me. She loved what I provided. She loved the security, the status, the endless flow of cash that allowed her to play the generous matriarch to her extended family. To her, I was not a husband. I was a utility, a walking, breathing bank account that had suddenly malfunctioned by demanding basic human respect. I did not yell. I did not argue. I did not try to reason with her. Arguing with a parasite only proves that you still care about the host. I simply looked into her cold, demanding eyes and nodded slowly. "You are right, Cynthia," I said, my voice shockingly calm. "I should leave." I turned my back on her and walked heavily down the hallway toward the front door. I heard her scoff behind me, muttering something about me acting like a child, assuming I was just going to take a drive around the block to cool off. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the warm summer air, walking down the manicured driveway to where my luxury sedan was parked. The sounds of the party were already starting up again in the backyard. The music resumed. The laughter returned. My absence was not a tragedy to them. It was a relief. I unlocked my car, slid into the soft leather driver's seat, and closed the door, sealing myself in silence. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel. My chest was sticky with drying wine. My heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened an airline application. For years, I had dreamed of spending my retirement at a luxury fly fishing lodge in Bozeman, Montana. A quiet, isolated place surrounded by mountains and rivers. Every time I suggested the trip, Cynthia vetoed it, claiming it was a massive waste of money that we could instead use to help her brother Derek with his constantly failing business ventures. Without a second thought, I booked a one-way first-class ticket to Bozeman, departing from Logan Airport in exactly 3 hours. I reserved an executive cabin at the lodge for an indefinite stay. The transaction cleared instantly. I put the phone down, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. As I drove away from the multi-million-dollar estate I had built, I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I was driving away from my own life, and strangely, I had never felt lighter. The drive to the airport took an hour, and every mile that passed felt like shedding a physical weight. The highway stretched out before me, a ribbon of gray asphalt that reminded me of the thousands of miles of roads I had engineered in my youth. As the landscape blurred past the windows, my mind began to automatically review the ledgers of my life. I was an engineer. My brain was trained to analyze structural failures to find the exact point where a foundation gave way. And as I drove, the structural failure of my marriage became glaringly obvious. It was never just about a spilled glass of wine. That was only the final stress test that brought the whole rotten bridge crashing down. The truth was, I had been emotionally and financially blackmailed for decades. I thought about Derek, Cynthia's older brother. Derek was a man who possessed a spectacular talent for starting businesses that inevitably crashed and burned within 2 years. When his logistics company went bankrupt a decade ago, he was facing absolute ruin. It was my money, hundreds of thousands of dollars transferred from my hard-earned savings, that bailed him out, kept his house out of foreclosure, and kept his family fed. I thought about Morgan, the very girl who had just humiliated me. When Derek claimed he could not afford to send his precious daughter to the elite private university she had set her heart on, Cynthia had wept and begged me to intervene. I paid Morgan's entire tuition out of pocket. 4 years of Ivy League expenses, housing, and living allowances, all quietly funded by the dinosaur she so openly despised. And whenever I brought up the crushing financial burden, whenever I gently suggested that her family should start taking responsibility for their own lives, Cynthia always deployed the exact same plausible lie. Her voice would soften, her eyes would turn pleading, and she would say, "They are family. Harrison, we have been so blessed. We have more than enough. You are just being grumpy because you are stressed from work. Let me handle the family dynamics. You know Derek has too much pride to accept charity unless we frame it right." She gaslit me into believing that my desire for financial boundaries was actually a character flaw. She made me feel guilty for expecting gratitude. She trained me to believe that my role in the family was strictly to provide, and that requiring basic decency in return was somehow abusive or controlling. I had accepted that lie for years to keep the peace. I had traded my self-respect for the illusion of a happy home. But as the Boston skyline came into view, the fog of manipulation completely lifted from my mind. The absolute clarity was blinding. Cynthia did not just tolerate her family's disrespect toward me. She encouraged it. She validated it. By demanding that I apologize to a spoiled child who had intentionally assaulted me with a drink, she proved that in her hierarchy of priorities, my dignity ranked dead last. I pulled into the long-term parking garage at Logan International Airport. I parked the car, grabbed a small emergency overnight bag I always kept in the trunk, and walked toward the terminal. My shirt was still stained a deep, ugly purple, but I did not care. I felt a fierce, burning energy rising in my chest. I was not just going to take a vacation. I was going to war. As I walked through the sliding doors of the departure terminal, I pulled my phone out again. I looked at the contacts list, my thumb hovering over the names. I was leaving the physical location of the abuse, but distance was not enough. I needed to ensure that the people who viewed me as nothing more than a bank account would wake up to find the vault permanently sealed. I approached the first-class check-in counter, handed over my identification, and prepared to board a flight that would take me thousands of miles away from the parasites who had drained me for a lifetime. The game was over, and it was time to change all the locks. I stared at Cynthia, waiting for her to say something, anything, to defend her husband. Instead, she sighed, telling everyone I was the problem. The smell of barbecue sauce mixed with the stench of red wine soaking my clothes. The silence in the backyard was suffocating. Every relative stood, frozen eyes darting between me and the young woman who had just assaulted me. I turned my attention back to Morgan. She wore that smug, entitled smirk, her chin raised in defiance. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of a man who managed unruly construction crews for 4 decades. I said, "Morgan, that was entirely uncalled for. You deliberately stepped into my path and threw your drink on me. I expect a sincere apology right now." The moment the words left my mouth, Morgan's entire demeanor shifted. The smirk vanished, replaced by a trembling lip. She stepped backward, clutching her empty glass as if I had just threatened her. "Oh my God," she gasped, her voice wavering with manufactured distress. "Why are you being so aggressive? I just bumped into you by accident. You always have to make everything so hostile. You always try to make my family feel small just because you have money." Her father, Derek, immediately stepped forward. He puffed out his chest, placing an arm around his daughter. "Hey, back off, Harrison," Derek warned, pointing a finger at me. "She said it was an accident. There is no need to bully the girl in front of everyone." "Bully her," I repeated, my voice remaining perfectly level despite the rage boiling in my veins. "I paid for her entire Ivy League education, Derek. I paid off the mortgage on your house 10 years ago when your business went bankrupt. Asking for basic human respect in my own backyard is not bullying." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I had never mentioned the money before. I always kept my financial support a quiet secret to protect their pride. But the sheer hypocrisy of the moment demanded the truth. Morgan squeezed out a few fake tears, burying her face in her father's shoulder. Derek glared at me, his face turning a dark, angry red. Before he could speak, a hand clamped down hard on my forearm. It was Cynthia. Her grip was tight, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. Her face was flushed with fury, but that anger was not directed at the people who disrespected me. It was directed entirely at me. She yanked my arm, pulling me roughly toward the sliding glass doors. "Come inside right now," she hissed through clenched teeth. She dragged me into the hallway of our home and slammed the door shut behind us, cutting off the murmurs of her family. As soon as we were alone, she turned on me with a ferocity that chilled me. "What is wrong with you?" she demanded, her voice vibrating with rage. "You are embarrassing my family in front of everyone. How dare you bring up the money you gave Derek? You promised you would never throw that in their faces." I stared at the woman I had been married to for 38 years, bewildered. "I am embarrassing your family. Cynthia, your niece, deliberately threw a glass of wine on me and insulted my life's work. My work, I might add, that paid for the very ground she is standing on." Cynthia waved her hand dismissively, brushing away my words as if they were nothing. "Oh, please, Harrison, stop being so dramatic. Morgan is just passionate about the environment. She is young and outspoken. You always have to escalate things. You are making a scene over a stupid shirt." "It is not about the shirt, Cynthia. It is about respect in my own home. This is my home too," she snapped back, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "And these are my guests. I am not going to let your grumpy retirement attitude ruin this reunion. I am sick and tired of making excuses for your behavior. You think because you pay for things you can talk down to my family. Well, I will not stand for it." She took a step closer, pointing her finger at my stained chest. She delivered her ultimatum with absolute certainty. "You have 2 options right now, Harrison. You either walk back out there and apologize to Morgan for raising your voice, or you leave. Get out of my sight until you can learn how to treat my family properly." The silence that followed her ultimatum was absolute. I looked deeply into the eyes of the woman I had provided for my entire adult life. I looked at the fine lines around her eyes, the expensive diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, the custom-tailored dress she wore. I had bought all of it. I spent almost 4 decades working myself to the bone on freezing construction sites, managing massive infrastructure projects to ensure she never worried about a single bill. I had given her a life of pure privilege, and in return, when her niece humiliated me in public, she demanded that I apologize for being the victim. Something inside me snapped in that hallway. It was a quiet breaking, like a heavy steel chain finally giving way after years of tension. The illusion of my long marriage dissolved instantly. I saw her clearly for the first time. She did not love me. She loved what I provided. She loved the security, the status, and the endless flow of cash, allowing her to play the generous matriarch to her family. I was a walking bank account that suddenly malfunctioned by demanding basic human decency. I did not yell. I did not argue. Arguing with a parasite only proves you still care about the host. I simply looked into her cold eyes and nodded slowly. "You are right, Cynthia," I said, my voice shockingly calm. "I should leave." I turned my back on her and walked to the hall closet. I slowly grabbed my coat, ignoring her scoff behind me. She muttered something to me about me acting like a child, assuming I would take a drive around the block to cool off. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the warm summer air. I walked down the manicured driveway to where my sedan was parked. The sounds of the party were already starting up again in the backyard. My absence was not a tragedy to them. It was a relief. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door, sealing myself in silence. My chest was sticky with drying wine. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened an airline application. For years, I dreamed of spending my retirement at a luxury mountain lodge in Bozeman, Montana. Every time I suggested the trip, Cynthia vetoed it, claiming it wasted money she preferred spending on her family. Without a second thought, I booked a one-way ticket to Bozeman, departing from Logan Airport in exactly 3 hours. The transaction cleared instantly. I put the phone down, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway, never looking back. The drive to Logan International Airport took an hour, but time seemed to stretch and warp as I navigated the familiar highways. Every mile that passed felt like a physical weight lifting from my shoulders. The road ahead was a ribbon of gray asphalt that reminded me of the thousands of miles of infrastructure I had engineered in my youth. As the landscape blurred past the windows, my mind began to automatically review the ledgers of my life. I was an engineer by trade, meaning my brain was trained to analyze structural failures and find the exact point where a foundation finally gave way under too much pressure. And as I drove, the structural failure of my marriage became glaringly obvious. It was never just about a spilled glass of wine. That was only the final stress test that brought the whole rotten bridge crashing down into the river. The truth was that I had been emotionally and financially blackmailed for decades. I thought about Derek, the older brother of my wife. Derek was a man who possessed a spectacular talent for starting businesses that inevitably crashed and burned within 2 years. When his logistics company went bankrupt a decade ago, he was facing absolute ruin. It was my money, hundreds of thousands of dollars from my personal savings, that bailed him out, kept his house out of foreclosure, and kept his family fed. I thought about Morgan, the very girl who had just humiliated me in front of dozens of people. When Derek claimed he could not afford to send his precious daughter to the elite private university she had set her heart on, Cynthia wept and begged me to intervene. I paid the entire tuition out of pocket. 4 years of Ivy League expenses, housing, and living allowances, all quietly funded by the dinosaur she so openly despised. The sheer hypocrisy of her entitlement was staggering. She drove a car I paid for. She lived in a condominium where I covered the security deposit. She wore designer clothes bought with supplemental credit cards that were linked directly to my primary accounts. I had been a walking bank for her entire adult life. Yet in her mind, I was nothing more than an embarrassing relic to be mocked. My chest tightened as the memories flooded in one after another, forming a clear picture of systemic exploitation. I remembered all the times Derek needed a small loan to cover his payroll. I remembered the lavish family vacations to Europe that I funded entirely only to be left sitting alone at dinner while Cynthia and her relatives went on expensive shopping sprees. I was the silent sponsor of their opulent lifestyle, expected to pay the bills and remain quietly in the background. Whenever I brought up the crushing financial burden, whenever I gently suggested that her family should start taking responsibility for their own lives, Cynthia always deployed the exact same plausible lie. Her voice would soften into a patronizing tone, her eyes would turn pleading, and she would recite her favorite script. "They are family, Harrison," she would say, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "We have been so blessed in this life. We have more than enough to go around. You are just being grumpy because you are stressed from work, or you are just bored now that you are retired. Let me handle the family dynamics. You know Derek has too much pride to accept charity unless we frame it right." She gaslit me into believing that my desire for financial boundaries was actually a character flaw. She made me feel guilty for expecting gratitude. She trained me to believe that my role in the family was strictly to provide, and that requiring basic decency in return was somehow abusive or controlling. I had accepted that lie for years to keep the peace in my home. I had traded my dignity for the illusion of a happy marriage. But as the Boston skyline came into view, the fog of manipulation completely lifted from my mind. The absolute clarity was blinding, like stepping out of a dark room into the bright midday sun. Cynthia did not just tolerate the disrespect toward me, she actively encouraged it. She validated it by making excuses for their appalling behavior. By demanding that I apologize to a spoiled child who had intentionally assaulted me with a drink, she proved that in her hierarchy of priorities, my dignity ranked dead last. She was willing to humiliate her husband of 38 years just to keep her niece from throwing a tantrum. It was a revelation that struck me with physical force. The physical act of throwing wine on me and the furious demand from Cynthia that I apologize broke the spell completely. For decades, I had rationalized their toxic behavior. I had told myself they meant well, that they just struggled with expressing gratitude, that I was providing a foundation of love. But looking at the dried purple stain on my shirt, I finally accepted the cold, hard reality. Parasites do not love the host. They simply consume until there is nothing left to take. I pulled into the parking garage at Logan International Airport. The tires squeaked against the smooth concrete as I navigated up to the 4th floor, finding a quiet spot near the elevators. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence of the car for a moment. My hands gripped the steering wheel. I was a man who had dedicated his entire existence to building things that would last. Bridges that withstood storms, foundations that held up towering skyscrapers. I took immense pride in my ability to construct stability. But here I was, at 70 years old, realizing that the most important structure in my life, my marriage, was built on shifting sand. It was entirely hollow. I opened the trunk and grabbed a small emergency overnight bag I always kept packed for sudden business trips. It contained basic toiletries, a clean shirt, and essential documents. As I changed out of the ruined dress shirt and pulled on a simple gray sweater, I felt a fierce, burning energy rising in my chest. The sorrow of betrayal was rapidly being replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I was not just going to take a vacation. I was going to war. I walked toward the terminal doors, my stride steady and purposeful. I was leaving the physical location of the abuse, but distance was not enough. I needed to ensure that the people who viewed me as nothing more than a bank account would wake up to find the vault permanently sealed shut. I approached the premium check counter, handed over my identification, and prepared to board a flight that would take me thousands of miles away from the parasites who had drained me for a lifetime. The game was over, and it was time to change all the locks. I was finally claiming my absolute freedom. I took a deep breath, handed my heavy luggage to the polite desk attendant, paid the baggage fees, and smiled for the very first time in what felt like an absolute eternity. I headed toward the exclusive first-class departure lounge. Glass doors slid open, welcoming me into a sanctuary of quiet luxury. The bustling airport noise faded, replaced by classical music and the low murmur of wealthy travelers. I found a secluded leather armchair in the corner facing the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac. I ordered neat bourbon and watched commercial jets slowly taxi across the runway. The golden hour sunlight was casting long, dramatic shadows over the airplanes. As the bourbon warmed my chest, the adrenaline that carried me out of my driveway receded, leaving behind a sharp, cold clarity. My intuition, a primal instinct that had kept me alive on dangerous construction sites for 45 years, suddenly flared to life. I closed my eyes and replayed the incident. Frame by frame, like watching a slow-motion film, I analyzed the exact sequence of events. Something about Morgan's behavior was deeply unnatural. Spilling a drink is usually an accident. Calling someone a dinosaur is an insult. But doing both simultaneously in the center of the yard, perfectly positioned so that every single family member had a clear line of sight, felt entirely different. It felt like a performance. Morgan was arrogant, but she was not stupid. She knew I paid her bills. Openly provoking the man who funded her lifestyle without a safety net did not make logical sense unless the safety net was already guaranteed. The sudden transition from an arrogant smirk to hysterical tears was too seamless. It was staged. She wanted me to react. She needed an audience to witness me losing my temper. I took another slow sip of my drink, letting the burn focus my thoughts. If the confrontation was a staged provocation, what was the underlying motive? My mind began to sift through the events of the past few weeks, hunting for anomalies. An engineer knows that catastrophic failures never happen overnight. They are preceded by microfractures, subtle shifts in load-bearing walls that go unnoticed by the untrained eye. And then a massive red flag hit me with the force of a freight train. Just last Tuesday, Cynthia had approached me in my home office. It was a Tuesday morning right after breakfast. She walked in holding a thick stack of wealth management documents pre-labeled with colorful sticky notes indicating where I needed to sign. This was highly unusual. Cynthia loathed dealing with financial paperwork, always claiming it gave her a headache, and that she preferred leaving the numbers to me. Yet there she was, hovering over my desk, with a sleek pen, aggressively pushing me to sign the pages immediately. When I put on my reading glasses and examined the headers, I realized what the documents actually were. They were transfer authorization forms. She wanted me to legally move the royalties from a highly lucrative engineering patent I held, which was secured within an independent limited liability company, created a decade before I even met her directly, into our joint marital checking account. When I questioned her about this sudden desire to restructure my protected premarital assets, she did not hesitate. She deployed a perfectly rehearsed, plausible lie. She smiled sweetly, massaged my shoulders, and said it was simply for tax purposes. She claimed her accountant discovered a loophole that would save us tens of thousands of dollars, but only if the funds were consolidated immediately. I was exhausted from a poor night of sleep and almost signed the documents just to get her out of my office and avoid a lingering argument. Only a last-minute phone call from my doctor regarding a prescription refill distracted me, and I left the papers unsigned on my desk, promising to review them later. She had been asking me about those papers every single day since. The memory of those unsigned documents sitting in my study suddenly made my blood run cold. I continued digging through my recent memories, pulling at the loose threads of my wife's behavior. Another anomaly surfaced. For the last 3 weeks, Cynthia had been exhibiting a strange, restless energy late at night. 4 nights ago, I woke up around 2 in the morning with a dry throat. I walked down the carpeted hallway to get a glass of water from the kitchen. As I passed the closed door of the guest bedroom, I heard Cynthia's voice. She was whispering urgently into her mobile phone. I stopped and listened. I could not make out the exact words, but the tone was conspiratorial, rushed, and anxious. The moment I bumped the wooden doorframe with my elbow, the whispering stopped dead. Seconds later, Cynthia emerged from the room, looking pale and startled. When I asked her who she was talking to at that hour, she offered another smooth, frictionless excuse. She claimed it was just her brother Derek having a panic attack about his logistics business failing again, and that she was merely calming him down so he would not wake up his own wife. I opened my eyes and stared at a massive commercial airplane lifting off the runway. I am an engineer. I have spent my life calculating stress loads, tension, and structural integrity. I understand how things are built, and more importantly, I understand how things are destroyed. My marriage was showing massive stress fractures, and none of them were occurring by accident. Just like a corrupt business partner setting up a fall guy to take the blame for a sinking company, they were building the perfect structure to sink me. It was a controlled demolition. If a demolition team wants to bring down a skyscraper, they do not just hit it with a wrecking ball. They systematically weaken the core supports. They plant charges in the foundation. They orchestrate a sequence of precise events so the building collapses exactly where they want it to. Cynthia and Derek were the demolition team. The late-night calls were the planning phase. The push to transfer my protected patent royalties into an exposed joint account was the planting of the explosive charges. And Morgan spilling the wine on me in front of 30 witnesses, that was the detonator. They needed me to lose my temper in public. They needed an audience to witness me yelling. They wanted to create a narrative that I was becoming hostile, aggressive, and perhaps even cognitively unstable in my old age. If I had signed those transfer documents last week, and if I had taken the bait and exploded at Morgan today, the trap would have snapped shut around my neck. The realization was horrifying, but it was also profoundly liberating. I was not losing my mind. I was simply surrounded by predators. I took a final sip of my bourbon, a grim smile forming on my lips. They spent months carefully plotting this operation, assuming my love for my wife would keep me utterly blind to their deception. They thought I was a tired old man who would quietly surrender his wealth and disappear while they claimed the empire I built. They made one fatal miscalculation. An engineer never panics when a structure fails. He steps back, analyzes the blueprints, and prepares a controlled demolition of his own. The flight from Boston to Bozeman felt like crossing the threshold into an entirely different dimension of existence. When the commercial jet finally touched down on the rugged Montana tarmac, the crisp, thin mountain air was a sudden and welcome shock to my system. I rented a heavy four-wheel drive vehicle and began navigating the winding, desolate mountain roads toward the luxury lodge I had hastily booked just hours prior. The headlights cut through the descending darkness, illuminating the rugged terrain. A light dusting of unseasonal snow clung to the towering pine trees bordering the highway, and the absolute silence of the sprawling wilderness wrapped around the car like a heavy blanket. It was a profound, almost jarring contrast to the suffocating noise and the claustrophobic social performance of my own backyard. I arrived at the isolated cabin shortly before midnight. The property was magnificently constructed, built with massive timber logs, and featuring a towering stone fireplace that dominated the main living area. I unlocked the heavy wooden front door, stepped inside the cavernous space, and immediately felt a sense of profound ownership over my surroundings. There were no demanding voices echoing from the kitchen. There were no entitled relatives treating me like a disposable servant in my own home. I walked straight to the small wet bar located near the leather sofas, found a heavy crystal glass, and poured myself a generous measure of aged bourbon the lodge management had provided. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I let the amber liquid burn a warm path down my throat, grounding me in the reality of the present moment. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, I was entirely alone, and the solitude felt completely intoxicating. I walked over to a heavy leather armchair, positioned directly in front of the unlit fireplace, and sat down. I reached into my heavy winter coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I had kept the device completely silenced and stored away during the entire flight and the subsequent drive up the mountain. When I pressed the power button and activated the glowing screen, a relentless cascade of notifications instantly flooded the device. There were 34 missed calls, all from my wife. The text messages were a highly predictable, frantic sequence of emotional manipulation, charting the exact psychological stages of a parasite, realizing its host had abruptly severed the vital connection. Her first tactic was brute force. The first few messages were furious and demanding, ordering me to return to the house immediately and stop throwing a childish tantrum in front of her family. 2 hours later, as my absence stretched on, the tone shifted into severe annoyance. She asked if I was hiding at a local hotel and aggressively demanded to know when I would be back to pay the caterers who were clearing the backyard. But the most recent messages, sent just as my flight was beginning its descent into Bozeman, were entirely drenched in a sickening artificial sweetness. "Harrison, honey. Please call me back right now," she wrote in a long paragraph. "We are all just so worried about your mental state today. Come home so we can talk this out like reasonable adults. I love you." I stared at the glowing digital text on the screen, searching my heart for any lingering trace of affection or guilt. I found absolutely nothing. There was only the cold, clinical observation of an engineer watching a faulty mechanism attempt to execute a broken program. She was deploying every emotional tool she had cultivated over 38 years of marriage, completely unaware that I had permanently dismantled the control panel. I placed the smartphone face down on the heavy wooden coffee table, effectively muting her digital desperation. I reached into my leather travel bag and retrieved my personal tablet. Approximately 1 year ago, I had invested a significant amount of capital into a highly sophisticated military-grade smart home security system. I possessed a rather valuable and meticulously curated collection of vintage mechanical watches. These pieces were personal rewards I had acquired over 40 years of traveling across the globe for grueling engineering infrastructure projects. To ensure their safety while I was traveling for work, I hired an expert private security firm to install discrete high-definition cameras throughout the primary living areas of our Boston estate. The lenses were masterfully concealed within the crown molding of the main living room, the hallways, and my private study. Cynthia absolutely despised modern technology. She vehemently refused to learn how to operate the smart thermostat and frequently complained about the frustrating complexity of the television remote control. Within a single week of the security installation, she had completely forgotten the cameras even existed in our home. More importantly, she certainly never realized that the system possessed highly sensitive, omnidirectional microphones that captured crystal-clear audio and instantly uploaded the encrypted files directly to a secure remote cloud server. She lived her life assuming the walls of our house kept her secrets perfectly safe. I opened the secure security application on my tablet, authenticated my administrative access with a quick biometric fingerprint scan, and selected the primary living room camera feed. The screen illuminated with a crisp, full-color view of the very room I had abandoned just hours ago. I navigated the digital timeline at the bottom of the screen, sliding the cursor back to the exact chronological moment I had walked out the heavy oak front door that afternoon. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic thud against my ribs. I took another slow, steadying sip of my bourbon, bracing my mind for whatever deception I was about to witness. I pressed play and watched the footage of my own living room come to life. The ambient noise of the outdoor barbecue filtered through the microphones. I fast-forwarded through the mundane footage, watching the external party guests slowly begin to disperse as the afternoon shifted into early evening. The caterers packed up their equipment and loaded their vans. The distant relatives hugged, exchanged their superficial goodbyes, and drove away in their expensive cars. Finally, the house emptied out, leaving only the innermost circle behind in the large living room. I watched the screen intensely, searching for the final definitive piece of the puzzle I needed to construct my counterattack. I needed to know exactly what was said behind closed doors when they firmly assumed I was entirely out of earshot and completely neutralized. I needed the raw, unfiltered proof of the controlled demolition I suspected they were orchestrating against my life, my wealth, and my sanity. The high-definition video feed on my tablet screen flickered for a fraction of a second before stabilizing. The timestamp in the bottom right corner indicated it was exactly 14 minutes after I had pulled my car out of the driveway. The caterers were gone. The extended family members had all departed. The sprawling living room of my Boston estate, a room I had meticulously designed to be a sanctuary of comfort and warmth, was now occupied by only 3 people. Cynthia, Derek, and Morgan were gathered around the large marble kitchen island that opened into the living area. The ambient audio from the hidden microphones was astonishingly clear. I could hear the distinct celebratory pop of a heavy cork being pulled from a bottle of expensive champagne. It was a vintage bottle from my personal cellar, one I had been saving for our upcoming 40th wedding anniversary. Derek poured the sparkling liquid into 3 tall, crystal flutes, his posture completely devoid of the righteous anger he had displayed on the patio just an hour prior. Morgan, who had been weeping hysterically and trembling like a fragile leaf when she accused me of bullying her, was now leaning against the marble counter with perfect posture. Her tears were entirely gone. Her face was relaxed, her makeup untouched, and she was smiling broadly as she accepted the glass of champagne from her father. They raised their glasses in a synchronized toast. I sat in the heavy leather armchair in my Montana cabin, the warmth of the bourbon fading from my chest, replaced by a deep, icy chill. They were not mourning a family argument. They were celebrating a successful operation. I turned the volume up on my tablet, pressing the device closer to my chest. Derek took a long sip of his champagne, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and set the glass down on the marble counter with a heavy thud. He let out a loud, triumphant bark of laughter that echoed through the quiet house. "It worked perfectly," Derek said, his voice dripping with absolute satisfaction. Morgan pushed his buttons exactly right, and the old man finally snapped and walked out just like we needed him to. Morgan giggled, a sharp, grating sound that made my jaw clench. She took a sip of her drink and casually tossed her hair over her shoulder. "I told you it would be easy," she replied, her tone dripping with arrogant condescension. "He is so utterly predictable. I just had to hit his fragile ego about his stupid construction career, and he completely lost his mind. Did you see his face when I threw the wine? I thought he was going to have a heart attack right there on the patio." Cynthia walked into the frame, her custom-tailored dress swishing softly against her legs. She did not look like a woman whose husband of nearly 4 decades had just walked out the door in quiet devastation. She looked like a corporate executive who had just closed the most lucrative business deal of her entire career. Her face was a mask of cold, calculating triumph. She picked up her glass of champagne, clinked it against her brother's glass, and smiled a smile I had never seen before in my life. It was a predator's smile. "You both did your parts flawlessly," Cynthia said, her voice dropping into a low, conspiratorial whisper that the high-grade microphones picked up with terrifying clarity. "I have the abandonment paperwork completely ready to go. I spoke with my lawyer yesterday afternoon while he was out at the hardware store. My lawyer said that if he leaves the state and refuses to answer his phone, which we know his stubborn pride will force him to do, we can legally claim he is having a severe cognitive decline episode." Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on the marble island. "And the money?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with raw, undisguised greed. "What about his private accounts?" Cynthia took a delicate sip of her champagne and waved her hand dismissively. "It is all falling perfectly into place," she assured him. "Once he comes back home and signs those final transfer papers next week, all of his protected patent royalties will be dumped directly into the joint marital account. The second that money clears the bank, I will file the emergency petition for medical conservatorship. With the documented incident of his erratic, aggressive behavior at the party today, and the proof of his sudden, unexplained abandonment of the home, the judge will grant me total legal control over his finances. We take the entire estate. He will be locked out of his own life, and we will finally have the freedom to use the money however we see fit without his constant suffocating lectures about responsibility. My blood ran completely cold. The tablet in my hands felt like a block of solid ice. I paused the video, freezing the image of my wife smiling over a glass of stolen champagne as she plotted the total destruction of my life. I stared at her digitized face for a very long time. The silence of the isolated Montana cabin pressed against my ears. My breathing slowed down, becoming shallow and measured. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was almost impossible to process. This was not about a spilled glass of red wine. It was not about a spoiled niece demanding an apology. It was not even about a wife taking her family's side in a petty domestic dispute. It was a meticulously calculated, incredibly vicious legal ambush. They had weaponized my age, my wealth, and my natural desire to avoid public confrontation, to build a trap that would strip me of my autonomy and my entire life savings. They wanted to declare me mentally incompetent. They wanted to lock me in an invisible cage, steal the keys, and drain the vault dry. For 38 years, I had slept next to a woman who viewed me not as a partner, but as a target to be neutralized and harvested. I thought about all the sacrifices I made for her. I thought about the nights I spent away from home working on bridges in the freezing rain just so she could live in absolute comfort. I had given her everything, and her ultimate goal was to throw me into a facility and steal the rest. The sorrow that had initially followed me onto the airplane was now entirely gone. It evaporated instantly, burned away by a cold, focused fury. As an engineer, I knew that when a building is rigged to blow, the only way to survive is to cut the wires before the timer reaches zero. Cynthia thought she held the detonator. She assumed my absence meant I was passively waiting for her next move. She had absolutely no idea that by forcing me out of that house, she had unknowingly given me the exact distance and clarity I needed to strike back. I closed the tablet, picked up my phone, and prepared to unleash hell. I was going to tear their entire financial world apart brick by brick and take back my life. I did not even bother to call my wife. The overwhelming urge to scream into the telephone, to demand an explanation, or to curse her for decades of profound deception was entirely absent. Anger is a hot, chaotic, and dangerous emotion that makes people sloppy. What I felt was absolute freezing precision. I sat in the silent wood-paneled room of the Montana cabin, the warmth of the fireplace casting long shadows across the floor, and I opened my contacts list. I did not search for a marriage counselor or a family mediator. I scrolled down to a number I had kept on retainer for years but rarely utilized. I pressed the call button for Bradley Pierce. Bradley was a notoriously ruthless, high-powered asset protection attorney based in a glass tower in Manhattan. He was not a lawyer who negotiated amicable separations. He was a legal architect who specialized in dismantling hostile financial takeovers and building impenetrable fortresses around the wealth of his clients. The phone rang twice before he answered with his customary sharp, professional tone. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him my marriage was over, that my wife was actively plotting to declare me mentally incompetent, and I had the raw evidence to prove it. I securely transmitted the encrypted video file from my smart home system directly to his private server. I waited on the line, listening to the faint sound of him typing on his keyboard as he opened the file. I sat perfectly still as the audio of Cynthia, Derek, and Morgan drinking my vintage champagne and detailing their fraudulent ambush played through his office speakers. When the recording finished, the line was quiet for a long, heavy moment. Bradley did not express sympathy or shock. He simply asked me what my preferred objective was. I told him I wanted to execute the nuclear protocol. I wanted to legally sever every single financial artery connecting my wealth to her family, and I wanted it done with absolute uncompromising severity. Bradley immediately shifted into action, outlining the systematic destruction of their financial safety net. The very first target was the massive transfer of my patent royalties. I ordered him to contact my wealth management firm and place a permanent, irrevocable hold on the pending documents Cynthia had been aggressively pushing me to sign. the independent limited liability company that held those patents, would remain completely insulated. The millions of dollars she thought were about to flood into our joint checking account would remain out of her reach. Next, we discussed the primary estate in Boston. Cynthia firmly believed she was entitled to the sprawling house, confidently assuming the courts would award her the property in a divorce or a conservatorship ruling. She was profoundly mistaken. I calmly explained to Bradley that the Boston estate had been purchased entirely through an exclusive holding company I had established long before I ever met Cynthia. Because my personal funds paid for every mortgage installment, every renovation, and every property tax bill, and because her name was never added to the holding company's charter, she had absolutely no legal claim to the property. She had spent 38 years acting like the queen of a castle she did not even own. With the major assets secured, we moved on to the immediate tactical strikes. I instructed Bradley to initiate a total financial lockdown. Over our marriage, I had deposited 95% of our liquid capital into our joint marital checking and savings accounts. Cynthia used these accounts as her personal treasury, freely funding Derek's failed business ventures and Morgan's luxurious lifestyle without ever consulting me. I ordered Bradley to quietly and legally drain those joint accounts of every single cent that originated from my income deposits. He was to transfer the capital into a newly established private individual account under my exclusive control. We would leave exactly the amount generated by her own minimal, long-forgotten pension. She would wake up to find her limitless ocean of wealth reduced to a shallow, stagnant puddle. But taking away her money was not enough. I needed to cut off the parasites directly. I told Bradley to contact the credit card companies and immediately freeze every supplemental card I had ever authorized. The platinum card Derek used to fund his lavish client dinners was deactivated. The premium rewards card Morgan used to purchase her designer clothing and fund her high-end apartment furnishings was permanently canceled. The satisfaction of issuing those directives was intoxicating. For years, I had allowed them to treat me like a disposable utility, blindly believing that my generosity would eventually earn their respect. I had ignored my own boundaries to keep the peace, inadvertently funding their arrogance. Now, with a single phone call, I was shutting off the power to their entire reality. Bradley confirmed that his team of paralegals and financial associates would begin filing the necessary injunctions and processing the account freezes the moment the banks opened the following morning. He advised me to remain in Montana to continue ignoring her frantic phone calls and to let them believe their plan was still in motion. He emphasized that the element of surprise was our greatest weapon. If Cynthia thought I was just sulking in the mountains, she would not attempt to move any funds or hide any assets before our legal locks clicked into place. I agreed to his terms. After I ended the call with Bradley, I stood up from the leather armchair and walked over to the massive windows overlooking the dark, snowy landscape. The Montana wilderness was silent, vast, and completely indifferent to the petty human drama unfolding thousands of miles away in Boston. I felt a profound sense of alignment with the cold, unyielding mountains. I had spent my life building structures designed to withstand enormous pressure. When the people I trusted most decided to test my structural integrity, they foolishly assumed I would simply collapse under their weight. They did not realize that I was reinforced by decades of hard-earned resilience. I poured myself one final small measure of bourbon, raising the glass to my reflection in the dark window pane. I was no longer the tired, compliant husband who swallowed his pride to avoid a confrontation. I was the architect of their impending ruin. By tomorrow morning, the credit cards would decline. The bank accounts would show empty balances. The false reality they had constructed on the foundation of my labor would evaporate into thin air. I finished my drink, walked into the bedroom of the luxury cabin, and lay down on the heavy mattress. For the first time in recent memory, my mind was not plagued by the exhausting demands of my wife or the insulting behavior of her relatives. My thoughts were clear, methodical, and perfectly calm. I closed my eyes, listening to the gentle whistling of the mountain wind outside the heavy timber walls, and drifted into a deep, uninterrupted sleep, ready for the dawn of a completely new era. I had successfully dismantled their entire financial ecosystem, and they would soon wake up to a harsh new world where they finally had to pay their own way. The following morning arrived with a piercing brightness that reflected off the snow-capped peaks visible from my bedroom window. I woke up feeling entirely rested, my mind operating with the sharp, methodical precision of a man who finally understood the exact dimensions of his battlefield. I brewed a strong cup of dark roast coffee in the quiet kitchen and sat by the large stone fireplace. At precisely 8 o'clock, my satellite phone rang. It was Bradley Pierce. He did not waste time exchanging pleasantries. He informed me that the financial locks were officially in place. The joint accounts were drained of my contributions, the supplemental credit cards were entirely frozen, and the wealth management firm had permanently halted the transfer of my patent royalties. The fortress was secure, but building walls was only the first phase of our operation. I needed to understand the full extent of the structural damage Cynthia had caused over the years. Bradley understood this perfectly. He told me he had brought someone else onto the line. A man named Victor Russo introduced himself. Victor was a senior forensic accountant, a man whose entire career was dedicated to tracking stolen money through complex labyrinths of corporate shell companies and hidden offshore accounts. He was a financial bloodhound, and I was giving him my wife's scent. I provided Victor with full administrative access to my entire financial history. I handed over digital keys to decades of bank statements, tax returns, and business expense ledgers. I told him to tear through every single transaction Cynthia had ever executed, looking for any anomaly, no matter how small. Victor accepted the directive with a calm professional assurance that put me entirely at ease. He promised to deliver a preliminary report within 48 hours. With the investigative machinery quietly humming in the background, I needed to maintain my cover. If Cynthia suspected that I was mobilizing a team of ruthless financial experts from a mountain cabin, she would immediately contact her own lawyers and attempt to destroy any lingering evidence. I had to continue playing the role of the emotionally devastated, clueless old man who was simply blowing off steam in the wilderness. So I dressed in heavy insulated waders, grabbed a high-quality fly fishing rod from the lodge equipment room, and walked down to the pristine river that cut through the property. The water was freezing and crystal clear, rushing over smooth gray stones. I spent the entire afternoon standing in the rushing current, casting a delicate tide fly into the water. It was a rhythmic, meditative process that required absolute focus. Fly fishing is an exercise in deceptive simplicity. You have to present the artificial bait in a way that looks completely natural to the trout swimming below the surface. You have to make the illusion seem utterly flawless. As I cast my line repeatedly, I realized I was doing the exact same thing to my wife. I was floating an illusion of vulnerability on the surface, waiting for her to strike, while keeping the deadly hook perfectly concealed. Throughout the day, my phone vibrated in the breast pocket of my waterproof jacket. Cynthia was still calling. The frequency of her attempts was increasing, indicating that the initial stages of panic were likely setting in as the bank accounts began to decline her transactions. I ignored every single call. I let the phone ring until it diverted to voicemail, feeding her the exact narrative she expected. I caught 3 beautiful rainbow trout that afternoon, releasing them back into the cold water. I felt a deep, abiding connection to the methodical patience required to outsmart a target. 2 days later, the trap I had set beneath the surface finally caught something massive. I was sitting on the wooden deck of the cabin, cleaning my fishing gear, as the sun dipped below the jagged mountain ridgeline, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and bruised orange. My secure phone rang, displaying Bradley's encrypted number. I answered immediately, stepping inside the cabin and locking the heavy timber door behind me. Bradley was on the line, and he had Victor Russo with him. Victor did not sound like the calm, detached accountant I had spoken to 48 hours prior. His voice carried a tight, urgent energy. He told me that he had finished peeling back the layers of my business accounts, specifically focusing on the discretionary funds Cynthia had managed for household and secondary business expenses. I sat down at the heavy dining table, pulling a notepad toward me. Victor explained that he had uncovered a massive systematic embezzlement operation that had been running continuously for the past 5 years. My wife had not just been using my money to fund her extravagant lifestyle. She had been actively stealing from my corporate infrastructure. Victor detailed how Cynthia had established a shadow vendor in our accounting software. It was listed as a specialized logistical consulting firm, billing my primary engineering company for monthly retainer fees and fabricated project expenses. Because Cynthia handled the preliminary bookkeeping for that specific division before handing it over to my external auditors, she was able to seamlessly approve the invoices without triggering any internal alarms. The payments were categorized as routine operational costs. I asked Victor for the total amount of stolen capital. He paused for a fraction of a second before delivering the number. Over the course of 5 years, Cynthia had funneled just over $800,000 out of my corporate accounts. My lungs felt incredibly tight, as if the oxygen had suddenly been entirely vacuumed out of the quiet room. $800,000. It was a staggering sum of money methodically drained from the company I had built with my own 2 hands. I asked Victor where the fraudulent consulting firm was registered and who the primary beneficiary was. I already knew the answer in my gut, but hearing it spoken aloud made the betrayal entirely concrete. The fraudulent firm was registered to a small post office box in southern Florida, and the sole managing director was indeed Derek, my wife's older brother. The narrative Cynthia had fed me for years was that Derek was a proud, struggling businessman who needed occasional, modest family support to keep his legitimate logistics company afloat. I had felt sympathy for his supposed failures, but Victor's forensic tracing revealed a completely different reality. Derek had not used the embezzled funds to save any failing business. The money was traced directly from the fake consulting firm into a private real estate trust. Derek had used my stolen $800,000 to purchase a luxury oceanfront beach house in the Florida Keys. They had bought a tropical vacation home with my stolen corporate funds, all while smiling in my face at family dinners and calling me an out-of-touch dinosaur. I thanked Victor for his exceptional work and ended the call. The silence of the cabin settled around me once more. The pieces of the puzzle were no longer just suspicious. They formed a perfectly clear picture of criminal conspiracy. The time for quiet, patient fly fishing was now completely and permanently over. I sat at the heavy oak dining table for a long time after disconnecting the call with Victor. The knowledge that my wife had actively stolen $800,000 from my life's work to buy her brother a beachfront property in Florida was a heavy, suffocating weight. But I did not have the luxury of giving in to the shock. I had to remain entirely focused. I walked into the kitchen, poured the remaining cold coffee down the stainless steel sink, and washed my hands. As I was drying them on a towel, the satellite phone resting on the kitchen counter began to vibrate. The screen illuminated, displaying a high-resolution photograph of Cynthia smiling at a charity gala we had attended last year. The image, once a source of quiet pride for me, now looked like the mask of a sociopath. She had been calling me relentlessly for 3 days. Until now, my silence had been a tactical necessity, a way to build her panic and keep her off balance while my legal team secured my assets. But now that I had the complete forensic blueprint of her criminal conspiracy, it was time to change my strategy. I needed to feed her a false sense of security. I needed her to believe that her demolition plan was still perfectly on track. I took a deep, steadying breath, cleared my throat to ensure my voice sounded appropriately raspy and exhausted, and pressed the green button to accept the call. "Harrison! Oh my goodness, you finally picked up." Cynthia's voice burst through the small speaker. There was no trace of the vicious, snarling woman who had ordered me out of our hallway just days prior. There was no hint of the cold, calculating conspirator I had watched drinking my vintage champagne on the security cameras. Instead, her tone was drenched in a thick, artificial sweetness. It was the exact voice she used when she was charming wealthy donors at her social club. "Harrison, honey, I have been absolutely sick with worry about you. Where on earth have you been? You completely overreacted to the silly situation with Morgan, and walking out like that really scared me." but I am just so relieved to hear your voice." I held the phone away from my ear for a fraction of a second, marveling at the sheer psychological agility required to transition so seamlessly from a predator to a concerned, loving wife. She did not pause to let me answer. She seamlessly transitioned into her primary objective, wrapping her financial ambush in a layer of fake marital devotion. "You know I forgive you for making a scene and walking out on the family, Harrison. We have been married for 38 years, and I know you just get a little overwhelmed at these big gatherings. But you need to come home now. We have to finalize those routine tax papers on Tuesday. My accountant called again this morning and said if we do not sign the transfers by midweek, we are going to face massive penalties. Let us just put this ugly weekend behind us and focus on our future together. Come home, honey." The physical revulsion that washed over me was incredibly difficult to suppress. Listening to her confidently speak about our future together, knowing with absolute certainty that she was actively preparing to petition a court to declare me mentally incompetent, the very second those funds cleared required every ounce of discipline I possessed. She was offering me forgiveness for a crime she orchestrated. She was using the word honey while actively attempting to steal the last remaining protected assets I owned. I closed my eyes tightly, visualizing the structural blueprints of a suspension bridge. When wind shear threatens to tear a bridge apart, the structure must be designed to flex and sway with the pressure absorbing the kinetic energy rather than resisting it rigidly and snapping in half. I had to flex. I had to absorb her manipulation and reflect back exactly what she wanted to see. I had to swallow my pride, my disgust, and my overwhelming desire to confront her with the stolen $800,000. If I accused her now, if I let any trace of my righteous anger bleed into my voice, she would immediately realize I knew the truth. She would hang up the phone call her brother Derek, and they would immediately begin hiding the remaining capital and shredding documents. I could not allow that to happen. I needed her to feel totally victorious. I forced my shoulders to slump even though she could not see me. I deliberately softened my voice, injecting a slight trembling hesitation into my words. I channeled the persona of a tired, defeated old man who had finally realized the futility of fighting against his younger, more vibrant family. "You are right, Cynthia," I said, letting out a long, heavy sigh that sounded remarkably authentic. "I am sorry for worrying you. I just needed to get away and get some fresh air." My chest was tight, and I felt like I was suffocating in that house. I flew out to the lodge in Montana. I have just been out here standing in the river, fly fishing, and trying to clear my head. It was stupid of me to just disappear like that. I could practically hear the triumphant relief radiating through the telephone line. Montana. "Oh, Harrison, you are so stubborn," she said, her voice dripping with a patronizing warmth. "Well, I am glad you got some time to yourself to cool off. The mountain air is exactly what you needed to calm your nerves. But you really must come back. When is your return flight? We simply cannot miss this tax deadline on Tuesday." I paused, pretending to consult a travel itinerary. "I will book a flight out tomorrow," I told her, keeping my tone submissive and compliant. "I should be back at the house late Wednesday evening. I will come straight into your office and we can sit down and sign all of those transfer papers together." "You are right, Cynthia. Let us just make things right and move forward." "Oh, that is wonderful news, honey," she replied, her excitement now entirely genuine. "I will have a nice warm dinner waiting for you on Wednesday night. We will get the paperwork sorted out and everything will go right back to normal. Have a safe flight, Harrison. I love you." I told her I loved her too, the lie, tasting like ash in my mouth, and I disconnected the call. I placed the phone gently down on the kitchen counter. A cold, genuine smile slowly spread across my face in the quiet isolation of the cabin. She eagerly swallowed the bait hook, line, and sinker. She firmly believed she had successfully broken my spirit. She believed she had won the war. She had absolutely no idea that by accepting my fabricated timeline, she had just handed me the exact logistical window I needed to completely destroy her. She was expecting a defeated, compliant husband, to walk through the front door late Wednesday evening to sign his own financial death warrant. Instead, by Monday morning, my lawyers would drop the legal guillotine, and her perfect stolen reality would be violently and permanently severed before I even set foot on an airplane. I woke up long before the sun crested the Montana mountains. It was Monday morning. The air outside the cabin was freezing, but inside the fire was roaring. I brewed dark coffee and sat at the dining table with my secure laptop open. Today, the architecture of my vengeance would be fully revealed. At exactly 8 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, my attorney Bradley Pierce initiated the sequence we meticulously planned over the weekend. He did not file the divorce petition in the local Boston courts where Cynthia had cultivated relationships with society elites. Instead, using the legal framework of my holding companies, Bradley filed the petition in a jurisdiction deliberately chosen for its aggressive protection of premarital assets. The paperwork was ironclad, listing severe financial abuse and documented embezzlement as primary grounds for the immediate dissolution of our marriage. While Bradley was submitting those explosive legal documents, I knew exactly what my wife was doing. It was Monday morning, meaning Cynthia was following her rigid, opulent schedule. She would be driving the luxury sports car I purchased for her to the exclusive country club. She would be sitting in the dining room drinking sparkling water, gossiping with wealthy wives. She would be signing for her expensive spa treatments without a single thought about the man paying the bill. She was likely boasting about how she successfully reined in her grumpy husband, proudly telling friends that I was flying back Wednesday to transfer millions into her accounts. She felt totally secure in the reality she had manipulated, trusting that the safety net of my endless wealth would always catch her. She had no idea the net was cut. At 9 in the morning, the second phase of the operation executed flawlessly. Bradley dispatched emergency injunctions directly to the executive compliance officers at my primary banking institutions. The financial lockdown was instantaneous and absolute. The joint marital checking accounts, high-yield savings accounts, and discretionary household funds were frozen. Every single cent originating from my corporate dividends and personal salary was immediately diverted into a heavily guarded, individual trust account under my exclusive control. The banks were legally bound to leave only the meager funds that could be directly traced to Cynthia's minimal pension. It was an amount barely sufficient to cover basic groceries, let alone the exorbitant membership fees of her country club or the monthly maintenance costs of the Boston estate. The deep well of capital she drew from for decades evaporated in the blink of an eye. The financial severing did not stop with the liquid cash. I watched my laptop screen as Bradley forwarded confirmation emails from the major credit card conglomerates. The supplemental platinum and titanium cards I authorized for my wife, her brother Derek, and her arrogant niece, Morgan, were simultaneously terminated. These were the very cards that funded their luxurious Florida vacations, their designer wardrobes, and expensive restaurant dinners. The credit limits on those accounts were essentially infinite, giving them the illusion of boundless personal wealth. With a few keystrokes from a paralegal in a Manhattan skyscraper, those sleek metal cards were instantly transformed into useless invalid pieces of plastic. They were completely severed from the financial artery keeping their artificial status alive. They were now financially stranded, entirely exposed to the crushing weight of the lifestyle they grew accustomed to but could never independently afford. As the banks locked their digital doors, the final most devastating domino was pushed over by Victor Russo. The forensic accountant spent the entire weekend finalizing the sprawling, meticulously documented dossier of Derek and Cynthia's criminal conspiracy. It was a masterpiece of financial tracking. Victor mapped every fraudulent wire transfer, every fake invoice generated by the shadow consulting firm, and the exact routing numbers funneling my stolen corporate money into Derek's Florida beach house. This was no longer just a messy civil divorce over marital assets. This was a documented case of systemic wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. At 10 in the morning, Victor securely transmitted the comprehensive dossier directly to the federal authorities, specifically targeting the Financial Crimes Division, handling interstate wire fraud. The inclusion of federal authorities was the ultimate insurance policy. If Cynthia tried fighting me in divorce court, playing the victim, to demand alimony to maintain her standard of living, the documented evidence of her active participation in a federal crime would immediately destroy her credibility. She could not ask a family court judge for a fair share of an estate she actively embezzled from for 5 years. Furthermore, Derek was now squarely in the crosshairs of federal investigators. He used the United States banking system to launder stolen money across state lines to purchase real estate. The authorities would not simply send him a warning letter. They would freeze the Florida property, seize his hidden accounts, and begin building a criminal prosecution carrying the very real threat of a lengthy prison sentence. I sat back in my chair in the Montana cabin, the warmth of the coffee mug seeping into my palms. The trap had sprung with flawless, devastating efficiency. Every single exit route they might have attempted to use was now heavily barricaded. They could not use my money to hire defense attorneys because they no longer had access to my money. They could not leverage the Boston house for a line of credit because the property was protected under my exclusive holding company. They could not even run away because federal authorities were now actively reviewing their names and fraudulent banking history. The controlled demolition was a complete success. The foundation of their parasitic existence was shattered, and the building was currently in free fall. All I had to do now was wait for the dust to settle and watch the devastating impact of gravity. The profound silence of the mountain morning was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was about to erupt on the East Coast. I closed the laptop, walked out onto the wooden deck, and breathed in the freezing pine-scented air. I felt an incredible sense of peace. For the first time in 38 years, I was not worried about managing Cynthia's emotions or fixing Derek's endless mistakes. I was no longer the silent shock absorber for their toxic behavior. I had finally prioritized my own survival. I was completely done sacrificing my happiness for people who viewed my hard work as nothing but an endless entitlement. I had spent my entire life building foundations for others, but this one was mine. I looked at the clear blue sky and waited. I knew it was only a matter of time before the first card was swiped. The first transaction was declined, and the comfortable stolen reality they lived in was violently ripped away. The financial guillotine had dropped. Now I just had to wait for the screaming to begin. The morning sun crested the jagged peaks of the Montana wilderness, casting long, brilliant rays of light through the massive glass windows of the cabin. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather armchair, next to the roaring stone fireplace, feeling an overwhelming sense of calm that I had not experienced in almost 4 decades. The thick ceramic mug in my hands was warm, filled with dark, bitter coffee that tasted entirely of freedom. A heavy wool blanket rested across my lap. The silence of the mountains was absolute, completely undisturbed by the toxic demands and the endless manufactured dramas of the life I had left behind in Boston. But while my physical reality was grounded in profound peace, the digital world resting on my lap was about to become an active war zone. I opened the lid of my encrypted laptop. The screen illuminated my face with a harsh blue glow. I logged into my secure banking portal, the central nervous system of my entire financial empire, and navigated to the real-time transaction dashboard. My attorney, Bradley Pierce, had executed the financial lockdown with flawless precision just a few hours prior. The trap was set, the gates were locked, and the vault was sealed. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the predator to blindly walk right into the electric fence. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 10:45 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, a bright red notification banner flashed across the top right corner of my laptop screen. A sharp, singular chime echoed in the quiet cabin. It was an automated security alert from my primary banking institution. I leaned forward, setting my coffee mug down on the wooden side table, and clicked on the notification to expand the details. The digital ledger revealed the exact location and the staggering magnitude of the attempted transaction, Cynthia. My wife of 38 years was currently standing inside a luxury automotive dealership located in one of the most expensive commercial districts of downtown Boston. She had confidently handed the financial representative my supplemental black card, attempting to authorize a single sweeping charge of $45,000. The transaction description was crystal clear. It was a massive down payment for a brand new top-of-the-line Tesla. And knowing Cynthia's driving preferences, I knew with absolute certainty that this vehicle was not intended for her. She preferred imported German sedans. This aggressively expensive electric car was meant to be a lavish conciliatory gift for her spoiled niece Morgan, the very same young woman who had deliberately thrown a glass of red wine on my chest less than 48 hours ago. The sheer audacity of the attempted purchase was staggering. Cynthia firmly believed that she had successfully driven me out of my own home, completely humiliated me, and broken my spirit. She believed that I was hiding in the mountains, thoroughly defeated, preparing to fly back to Boston to surrender the rest of my protected assets into her greedy hands. And to celebrate her perceived victory, she decided to reward the very child who had acted as the detonator for her cruel ambush. She walked into that high-end dealership with her head held high, fully expecting the endless river of my hard-earned capital to wash over her niece's desires just as it had always done. But the bright red text on my laptop screen told a very different story. Transaction declined. Account frozen. Please contact the primary card holder immediately. I stared at those words for a very long time, feeling a cold, righteous satisfaction blooming in my chest. For decades, that small piece of black plastic had been her magic wand. It was her tool of absolute power, allowing her to command respect, buy loyalty, and maintain the illusion of an infinite personal fortune. With a single keystroke from my legal team, that magic wand was instantly rendered entirely useless. It was now nothing more than a worthless, heavy piece of metal. I watched the screen intently, knowing exactly how Cynthia would react. She would be standing at the polished dealership desk, feeling a sudden hot flush of embarrassment rising in her cheeks. She would force a polite, dismissive laugh, assuring the confused sales representative that it was simply a routine security hold from the bank due to the unusually large amount of the purchase. She would reach into her designer leather handbag and confidently pull out her secondary card, the premium titanium account I had authorized for household emergencies. 3 minutes later, a second red notification flashed across my laptop screen. Another sharp chime echoed in the cabin. The titanium card was swiped for the exact same amount. The result was identical. Transaction declined. Account frozen. I could vividly picture the scene unfolding. The polite smile on her face would crack, replaced by a tight, strained grimace. The sales representative would look at her with a mixture of pity and annoyance, politely asking if she had another method of payment. She would inevitably snatch the cards back, claiming there was a ridiculous banking error that she needed to sort out immediately, and march out of the showroom in a cloud of furious indignation. She had just suffered her first taste of public financial humiliation, a small fraction of what she had allowed her niece to inflict upon me in our backyard. The cascade of failure was only just beginning. An hour later, the dashboard updated again. Having fled the dealership in absolute disgrace, Cynthia clearly needed to soothe her frazzled nerves. She drove straight to her exclusive country club, a place where she had spent years cultivating a reputation as a wealthy, generous matriarch. She marched into the luxury wellness center and attempted to charge a $400 premium spa treatment. The red banner flashed on my screen once more. Transaction declined. At this point, the initial embarrassment would be transforming into genuine suffocating panic. The country club was her sanctuary. To have a card rejected at the front desk of her most cherished social environment was a catastrophic blow to her carefully crafted ego. The receptionist, a woman Cynthia routinely treated with veiled condescension, would have to politely inform her that the payment could not be authorized. She would be forced to leave the lobby empty-handed, the whispers of the staff undoubtedly following her out the door. The illusion of her infinite wealth was visibly crashing down in real time, brick by expensive brick. 15 minutes after the country club rejection, the most desperate alert of the morning appeared on my screen. Cynthia had stopped at a local bank branch near our home. She bypassed the tellers and went directly to the automated teller machine outside the building. The notification showed an attempt to withdraw a maximum daily limit of $2,000 in physical cash from our primary joint marital checking account. I watched the screen as the system processed the request. Transaction declined. Insufficient funds. The account balance currently sat at exactly $0. The vault was completely empty. The river was dry. She was cut off from the empire I built. Everything she had taken for granted was now gone. I leaned back in my heavy leather armchair, taking a slow, deep breath of the pine-scented mountain air. The initial wave of satisfaction that washed over me was quickly replaced by a cold, clinical curiosity. I wanted to see the exact moment the reality of her situation finally breached the walls of her arrogance. I reached for my encrypted tablet, resting on the wooden coffee table beside my empty coffee mug. I opened the smart home security application and activated the live feed for the primary living room of the Boston estate. The high-definition camera flickered to life, showing the immaculate sunlit space exactly as I had left it. For several long minutes, the house remained perfectly still and quiet. Then the heavy oak front door flew open with such violent force that it slammed against the interior wall. Cynthia burst into the foyer. Her usually perfect posture was completely gone, replaced by a frantic, uncoordinated energy. She was practically sprinting into the living room, clutching her smartphone to her ear with a white-knuckled grip. Her face was flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson. Derek followed closely behind her. The confident, swaggering man who had threatened me on the patio was nowhere to be seen. He looked disheveled and pale, pacing nervously across the expensive Persian rug like a trapped animal. He kept rubbing the back of his neck, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for an escape route from a collapsing building. Cynthia ignored him entirely. She was screaming into the telephone, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The sensitive microphones captured her every word with pristine clarity. She was demanding to speak to the regional branch manager, furiously insisting that a catastrophic systemic error had frozen her accounts. She threatened to sue the bank to close all of her accounts and to have the customer service representative fired for gross incompetence. I watched her pace back and forth in front of the marble fireplace. She was employing every tactic of intimidation she had learned over 38 years of living behind the shield of my wealth. But intimidation only works when you actually hold the power. The customer service representative on the other end of the line was clearly not intimidated. I could hear the faint, muffled, and distinctly calm voice of the banking official emanating from the phone speaker. The representative was simply reading a legally mandated script. Cynthia abruptly stopped pacing. She stood perfectly still in the center of the living room, her chest heaving as she listened to the voice on the line. The representative politely but firmly informed her that there was no technical error. The representative explained that her status as an authorized user on the supplemental credit accounts had been permanently revoked by the primary cardholder. Furthermore, the bank official stated that the primary joint marital checking and savings accounts had been placed under a strict legal freeze pending an active and heavily documented divorce proceeding. The words hung in the air of the Boston estate like a physical weight. Divorce proceeding. Cynthia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The bright, angry flush that had colored her cheeks just moments before instantly drained away, leaving her skin a sickening, translucent shade of gray. Her knees seemed to buckle slightly, and she reached out to steady herself against the edge of the heavy glass coffee table. The smartphone slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. The screen cracked upon impact, but the line remained connected. The faint voice of the bank representative continued asking if there was anything else they could assist her with today. Cynthia did not answer. She simply stared blankly at the wall, her breathing shallow and rapid. The illusion of her total control was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She had assumed I was hiding in the mountains licking my wounds and preparing to surrender. She never imagined that I was actively dismantling the very foundation of her existence. Derek stopped his frantic pacing and stared at his sister. The heavy silence in the room was suffocating. He took a hesitant step forward, asking her what the bank had said. Cynthia slowly turned her head to look at him, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. She whispered that the accounts were frozen and that I had filed for divorce. Derek's face contorted in a mixture of confusion and sudden rising terror. He shook his head violently, denying the reality of the situation. He pulled his own smartphone from his pocket, his hands shaking so severely he could barely unlock the screen. He muttered that this made no sense, that the old man was too weak to pull something like this off. He opened his banking application to check the status of his supposed logistics consulting firm. I leaned closer to my tablet, watching the exact moment the federal trap snapped shut around his ankles. The moment the screen loaded, Derek let out a sharp, choked gasp. He stumbled backward, collapsing heavily onto the expensive linen sofa. The color completely vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of absolute horror. He stared at his phone as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. His accounts were not simply frozen by a civil family court order. His accounts were locked by a direct federal injunction. The federal authorities had moved with devastating speed, securing the stolen assets before he even realized he was under investigation. The money he had embezzled from my company to buy his beachfront property was entirely inaccessible. I quietly watched as Derek looked up from his phone, his eyes meeting his sister's terrified gaze. He stammered that his corporate accounts were seized. He told her that the bank application displayed a federal compliance warning. The realization of what this truly meant crashed down upon them simultaneously. This was no longer just a bitter dispute over a spilled glass of wine or a simple division of marital assets. They were completely exposed. The elaborate financial ambush they had meticulously plotted against me had been completely inverted. The very system they thought they had mastered was now actively hunting them. Cynthia sank down onto the floor, pulling her knees tightly to her chest. The arrogant, powerful matriarch who had commanded me to apologize in that very hallway was completely gone. In her place sat a broken, panicked woman who finally understood the catastrophic consequences of her boundless greed. Derek buried his face in his hands, rocking back and forth as the reality of a federal wire fraud investigation loomed over his rapidly vanishing future. I sat in the quiet comfort of the Montana cabin, watching the silent security feed on my tablet. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the cold, precise satisfaction of a structural engineer watching a condemned building fall exactly according to the calculated blueprints. The demolition was proceeding flawlessly. The dust was rising from the rubble of their shattered lives, and I was safely positioned thousands of miles away, untouched by the expanding wreckage. The live video feed playing on my encrypted tablet showed a scene of absolute devastation. I sat in the leather armchair of my Montana cabin and watched my wife of 38 years slowly collapse onto the expensive hardwood floor of our Boston foyer. Her brother Derek was pacing frantically near the living room sofa, clutching his head in his hands as the reality of a federal wire fraud investigation crushed his spirit. For several minutes, the only sound transmitted through the high-definition microphones was the heavy, ragged breathing of two predators who had suddenly realized they were securely locked inside a cage of their own making. Then the inevitable reaction finally occurred. Cynthia abruptly lifted her head. The shock that had paralyzed her features rapidly morphed into a blinding, desperate fury. She scrambled to her feet, her movements clumsy, and snatched her cracked smartphone off the ground. She jabbed her finger against the shattered screen. A split second later, the satellite phone resting on the wooden coffee table beside my empty mug began to vibrate violently. The shrill ringtone pierced the quiet atmosphere of the mountain cabin. I did not rush to answer it. I sat perfectly still, letting the phone ring 3 times, allowing her anxiety to reach a boiling point. On the 4th ring, I slowly reached out, picked up the device, and pressed the green button. I did not bring the receiver to my ear. Instead, I placed the phone flat on the tabletop and activated the external speaker. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands together on my lap, and waited for her to speak. The silence on the line lasted for only a fraction of a second, before her voice erupted from the small speaker. The artificial sweetness she had weaponized just a few days prior was completely gone. The polished tone she used to charm country club elites had entirely vanished. What replaced it was a raw, hysterical screech that vibrated with absolute malice. "What have you done?" she screamed, her voice cracking under the intense strain. "I was just humiliated at the bank. The manager told me my cards are canceled and the joint accounts are completely locked. They said you filed for a divorce. You vindictive, psychotic old man, reverse this immediately, or I swear to God I will destroy you." I watched her on the tablet screen as she shouted into the phone, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. Derek stopped pacing and stared at her, his eyes wide with fear. Cynthia ignored him, focusing all her venom directly on me. "You have completely lost your mind. Harrison," she yelled, her breathing erratic and heavy. "You are having a severe mental breakdown. You are a crazy, senile old man who does not even know what he is doing anymore. I am calling the police right now. I am calling my lawyers, and I am sending the authorities to whatever miserable cabin you are hiding in to have you committed to a psychiatric facility. You cannot just steal my money and lock me out of my own life. You owe me that wealth. I gave you my best years. I will have you declared legally incompetent before the sun goes down. Do you hear me?" I allowed her to scream until her voice gave out. I listened to her hyperventilating, waiting for the frantic echoes of her threats to fade into the quiet mountain air. When the line finally fell silent, save for her ragged gasps for breath, I leaned forward. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her chaotic energy. I spoke with an absolute chilling calmness that carried the heavy, unyielding weight of an anvil dropping onto a fragile pane of glass. I did not lose my mind. "Cynthia," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any emotion. I just checked the security cameras. The silence that instantly followed my statement was the most profound sound I had ever heard in my entire life. On the tablet screen, I watched Cynthia freeze entirely. Her mouth hung open. The phone remained pressed against her ear, but her hand began to tremble violently. "I knew you hated the smart home system I installed last year to protect my watch collection," I continued, speaking slowly so every single word would penetrate her panic. "I knew you forgot the cameras were even there. But they were always recording Cynthia. They recorded everything. They recorded the caterers leaving. They recorded Derek pouring my vintage champagne. And they recorded the very interesting conversation you had regarding my future." Before she could even attempt to formulate a desperate lie, I reached over to my laptop. I had already queued up the audio file from the security footage. I pressed the play button, turning the laptop volume to its maximum setting. The recording played directly into the speaker of my phone. Derek's voice echoed through the cabin and across the phone line. It worked perfectly. Morgan pushed his buttons, and the old man finally snapped and walked out. Then Cynthia's own voice played back to her, crisp and undeniable. "I have the abandonment paperwork completely ready to go. My lawyer said that if he leaves the state, we can legally claim he is having a severe cognitive decline episode. Once he signs those transfer papers next week, I will file for conservatorship, and we take the entire estate." I paused the recording. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. On the video feed, Cynthia slowly lowered the phone away from her face. She looked at Derek, who was now backing away toward the front door, his expression one of total defeat. The reality of their situation had finally crushed the last remaining fragments of their arrogance. They were caught. There was no plausible lie left to deploy. There was no emotional manipulation that could erase the sound of her own voice plotting my destruction. I picked up the satellite phone, bringing it close to my mouth. "You see, Cynthia?" I explained, my tone remaining dangerously calm. "I am an engineer. I understand how to calculate stress loads and I understand when a structure is intentionally rigged for a controlled demolition. You assumed my absence meant I was passively waiting for you to strike. You assumed my love for you made me blind, weak, and easily manipulated. But you made a catastrophic miscalculation. You handed me the exact distance I needed to uncover your treason and dismantle your entire operation. The federal authorities currently have the complete forensic dossier detailing how you and Derek embezzled $800,000 from my company to buy a beach house. The fraud is documented. The funds are seized. Your brother is going to prison, and you will likely follow him. You wanted me to disappear from your family. You wanted me gone so you could enjoy my wealth. Well, I am a generous man, and I grant you your wish. I bought a one-way ticket, Cynthia. I am never coming back to you. I hung up the phone now. I am completely free. It was Tuesday morning, exactly 24 hours after the financial locks had snapped shut. Cynthia and Derek had spent a sleepless, agonizing night trapped inside a mansion they could no longer afford, surrounded by luxuries they could no longer maintain. But the freezing of the bank accounts and the cancellation of the credit cards was merely the opening salvo. The true devastation was scheduled to be delivered directly to the front door by the relentless, unfeeling machinery of the legal system. My attorney, Bradley Pierce, did not believe in giving his opponents time to regroup or formulate a defense. He believed in overwhelming force. At precisely 9 in the morning, a sleek black town car pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of the Boston estate. Two men, wearing sharp, dark suits, stepped out of the vehicle. They were not ordinary delivery drivers. They were highly specialized premium process servers, hired specifically to ensure that the delivery of the legal documents was legally indisputable and formally recorded. They walked up the cobblestone path, their polished shoes clicking against the stones, and rang the heavy brass doorbell. Inside the house, I could perfectly imagine the scene through the lens of my remote security cameras. Cynthia was likely pacing the foyer, still wearing the same clothes from the day before, her hair unkempt, her mind desperately trying to find a loophole in the federal injunctions that had frozen her world. When the doorbell echoed through the quiet house, she probably assumed it was Morgan arriving to offer comfort, or perhaps a neighbor coming to check on the commotion. She unlocked the heavy oak door and pulled it open, expecting a friendly face. Instead, she was greeted by the cold, impassive expressions of the two legal couriers. They confirmed her identity with a brief clinical question. When she nodded, completely bewildered, the lead server handed her a massive, heavy stack of bound legal documents. He simply stated that she was being served, turned on his heel, and walked back to the waiting vehicle without another word. Cynthia stood in the open doorway, staring down at the thick folder resting in her trembling hands. As she slowly closed the door and began to read the cover page, the final fatal blow of my counterattack was officially delivered. The documents were a masterpiece of legal slaughter drafted by Bradley, to leave absolutely no room for negotiation or misinterpretation. The very first page was not just a standard divorce petition. It was an immediate, legally binding notice of eviction. For 38 years, Cynthia had proudly paraded around that sprawling estate, acting as if she were the rightful queen of the castle. She had completely forgotten, or perhaps willfully ignored, the foundational structure of our assets. Because the property had been purchased entirely through my exclusive premarital holding company, and because her name was never once added to the deed or the corporate charter, she was legally classified as nothing more than a tenant. And because that tenant had just been caught on tape plotting a fraudulent financial ambush against the property owner, her right to occupy the premises was instantly revoked. The eviction notice was brutal in its efficiency. It mandated that she vacate the premises within 72 hours. She was legally permitted to take only her personal clothing and her specific personal effects. Every piece of custom furniture, every expensive painting, every crystal chandelier, and every vintage bottle of wine in the cellar remained the exclusive property of my holding company. If she attempted to remove, sell, or destroy any of those assets, she would face immediate criminal charges for grand larceny. But the eviction notice was only the beginning of her nightmare. The second half of the folder contained the formal divorce filing. It was not a quiet, amicable separation based on irreconcilable differences. It was a vicious, highly detailed petition claiming extreme financial abuse, systemic fraud, and conspiracy to commit embezzlement. The filing explicitly referenced the security camera footage, legally cementing her own spoken words into the public court record. She had no defense. She could not play the victim to a sympathetic judge. She could not demand spousal support to maintain her lavish lifestyle, because the law does not grant alimony to a spouse who is actively engaged in a documented criminal conspiracy to defraud the primary earner. As Cynthia sank to the floor of the foyer, weeping uncontrollably over the legal documents that signaled her total ruin, a small silver sports car sped into the driveway. The front door opened again, and Morgan burst into the house. The arrogant, self-righteous young woman who had started this entire chain reaction with a spilled glass of red wine was completely unrecognizable. Her face was red and blotchy, stained with streaks of mascara. She was hyperventilating, clutching her designer purse to her chest as if it were a life preserver. Morgan had not come to the estate to offer her aunt emotional support. She had come because the invisible shield of my wealth, which had protected her from the consequences of her entire adult life, had suddenly vanished. She ran into the foyer and collapsed onto her knees beside Cynthia, her voice breaking into a high-pitched, panicked wail. Morgan grabbed Cynthia's arm, shaking her frantically. She screamed that her premium credit card had just been violently rejected by her landlord's payment portal. Her luxury apartment, located in one of the most exclusive and expensive neighborhoods in the city, required a massive monthly lease payment that I had quietly subsidized for the past 2 years. Without the automated transfer from my accounts, the payment had bounced, and the leasing office had immediately issued a notice of default. But the humiliation did not stop with the apartment. Morgan sobbed that she had just received an aggressive email from the loan servicing department of her Ivy League university. The private student loans I had been generously paying off on her behalf were suddenly entirely her responsibility. The total balance was staggering, a massive 6-figure debt hanging over the head of a 28-year-old woman who possessed absolutely no practical job skills and zero understanding of personal finance. Morgan looked at Cynthia, her eyes wide with desperate entitlement. She demanded that Cynthia fix the problem immediately. She begged her aunt to transfer the funds to cover the bounced rent check, blindly assuming that the family vault still held endless reserves of cash. She cried that her life was being ruined, that she would be evicted, and that she could not possibly be expected to pay back her own student loans. Cynthia simply stared at her niece with hollow, dead eyes. She slowly held up the thick stack of eviction and divorce papers, her hands trembling violently. She whispered that there was no money left. She confessed that my accounts were frozen, the credit cards were canceled, and she was being thrown out of the house in exactly 3 days. The realization hit Morgan like a physical blow. The safety net was gone. The two women sat on the floor of the grand foyer, surrounded by a breathtaking luxury they no longer owned, weeping over a self-inflicted destruction they could never reverse. I watched the tableau of misery unfold on my encrypted tablet from the quiet sanctuary of my mountain cabin. The high-definition camera captured every agonizing detail of their despair. For several long minutes, the grand foyer of the Boston estate was filled only with the sound of Morgan sobbing uncontrollably. Cynthia remained seated on the polished marble floor, staring blankly at the thick stack of eviction documents resting in her lap. The illusion of family solidarity, a facade they had maintained for decades, purely to keep my wallet open, was about to violently fracture under the crushing weight of their new reality. Derek burst through the front door a few minutes later, his face red and slick with sweat. He had just returned from a frantic meeting with his own lawyers, desperately trying to find a way to unlock his seized corporate accounts. He stopped in his tracks when he saw his sister and his daughter crumpled on the floor. He demanded to know what was happening. Cynthia slowly lifted her head, her eyes burning with a sudden vicious rage. She held up the eviction notice and informed him that they were being thrown out of the house in less than 3 days. She told him that I had filed for a divorce citing extreme financial abuse and that the federal authorities were actively building a wire fraud case against his fake logistics firm. The news hit Derek like a physical blow, but his shock quickly transformed into defensive anger. He pointed a trembling finger at Cynthia and began to shout. He accused her of mismanaging the entire operation. He yelled that she had moved far too slowly, that she should have forced me to sign those wealth transfer documents weeks ago instead of waiting for the family barbecue. Derek claimed that if she had just been more aggressive, they would already control my entire estate, and none of this would be happening. He blamed her incompetence for the destruction of his future. Cynthia scrambled to her feet, dropping the legal papers onto the floor. The elegant, composed matriarch was completely gone, replaced by a cornered animal lashing out at anyone in her path. She screamed back at Derek, her voice echoing harshly off the vaulted ceilings. She reminded him that it was my money that had saved him from total bankruptcy a decade ago. She yelled that he was an ungrateful parasite who could not even run a fake business without leaving a massive paper trail for federal investigators to find. She blamed him for being sloppy and drawing the attention of my forensic accountants. The argument escalated rapidly, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of blame and resentment. Morgan, still kneeling on the marble floor, suddenly stood up and inserted herself into the fight. The spoiled young woman shrieked at her father and her aunt. She cried that they had promised her an endless supply of wealth. She blamed them for encouraging her to sign a massive apartment lease she could never afford independently. She demanded to know how she was supposed to pay her student loans without my monthly deposits. Cynthia turned her furious gaze toward her niece. She stepped closer to Morgan, her face twisted in absolute disgust. Cynthia yelled that Morgan was the reason the entire plan collapsed in the first place. She screamed that Morgan just could not resist the urge to show off and be cruel. She told Morgan that throwing the glass of red wine on my shirt was a monumental mistake. Cynthia explained that the timeline was carefully calculated and that her childish, arrogant stunt had provoked me into walking out the door before the trap could be properly set. She called her niece a foolish, entitled brat who ruined everything just for a momentary thrill. Derek stepped between them, defending his daughter and shoving his sister back. The physical altercation was shocking to witness. These were people who just 48 hours prior had clinked crystal champagne flutes together and toasted to their brilliant, unified conspiracy against me. They had smiled and laughed, bound together by the shared objective of draining my life savings. But the absolute and undeniable truth was that their unity was entirely funded by my wallet. Once the money vanished, so did their family bond. The foundation crumbled, and they immediately turned on each other like starving wolves fighting over a single small, worthless scrap of rotting meat. I sat in the heavy leather armchair thousands of miles away, watching the implosion with clinical detachment. The scene playing out on the screen was ugly loud and profoundly pathetic. Derek paced the foyer, shouting that he would testify against Cynthia to save himself from federal prison. He threatened to tell the authorities that she was the mastermind behind the embezzlement scheme. Cynthia shrieked that she would ruin him, promising to hand over every single piece of evidence regarding his offshore accounts. Morgan simply cried louder, covering her ears and begging them to stop, realizing that neither her father nor her aunt possessed the capability to rescue her from her impending financial ruin. The toxicity they had tried to project onto me for years was now entirely contained within their own circle. For decades, Cynthia had manipulated me into believing that I was the problem. She had constantly told me that I was too harsh, too focused on money, and fundamentally incapable of understanding the deep, unconditional love of her family. She had used the concept of family loyalty as a weapon to silence my concerns and extract my wealth, but the hidden cameras revealed the absolute truth. There was no unconditional love in that foyer. There was no loyalty. There was only greed, panic, and a ruthless instinct for self-preservation at the expense of everyone else. I watched them pacing around the shattered remnants of their fabricated lives. Cynthia pointed a shaking finger at Derek, threatening to surrender his entire tax history to the authorities to secure a plea deal for herself. Derek retaliated by promising to expose her unauthorized access to my corporate files. They were perfectly willing to sacrifice each other to avoid a prison cell. It was a fitting conclusion to a lifetime of relentless deception. They had spent years united in their effort to drain my resources. Now they would spend the rest of their lives entirely divided by the catastrophic consequences of their own unyielding greed. I reached for the tablet and quietly deactivated the live security feed. I had seen enough. The satisfying closure I sought was not found in watching them tear each other apart. It was found in the absolute certainty that I was finally free from their parasitic grip. I closed the tablet, set it down on the wooden coffee table, and walked over to the large windows overlooking the rugged Montana mountains. The sun was beginning its descent behind the snow-capped peaks, casting long, peaceful shadows across the pristine wilderness. I poured myself a fresh cup of dark coffee and breathed in the cold, clean air. The frantic screaming in Boston felt like a distant, irrelevant echo. I had finally gained complete freedom. The first week of my new life in the Montana wilderness passed with a tranquil, deliberate rhythm. I spent my mornings hiking through the frost-covered pine forests and my afternoons casting lines into the rushing river. But while I was surrounded by the absolute stillness of nature, a devastating legal storm was finally making landfall on the East Coast. My attorney Bradley Pierce and my forensic accountant Victor Russo had handed the federal authorities a perfectly constructed, undeniable roadmap of systemic embezzlement. The government does not move with the emotional hesitation of a betrayed spouse. They move with the cold, mechanical precision of a predator that has caught the scent of blood. Exactly 7 days after I walked out of my Boston estate, the trap completely closed around the man who had confidently laughed at my expense. It was a Tuesday morning shortly before dawn when a convoy of dark, unmarked government vehicles quietly rolled into the upscale neighborhood where my brother-in-law resided. Derek was likely sleeping in his master bedroom, entirely oblivious to the fact that his stolen reality was about to violently expire. The federal agents did not ring the doorbell and patiently wait for him to answer. They pounded on the heavy wooden door with an aggressive, rhythmic force that demanded immediate compliance. When Derek finally opened the door, bleary-eyed and confused, he was not greeted by the respectful deference he felt entitled to. He was greeted by federal badges, search warrants, and the terrifying reality of a massive wire fraud indictment. The agents systematically entered his property, seizing his computers, his financial records, and his personal communication devices. They informed him that the luxurious beachfront property in the Florida Keys, the vacation home he had purchased using the $800,000 he stole directly from my corporate infrastructure, was officially seized under federal asset forfeiture laws. Derek was escorted out of his house in handcuffs, entirely stripped of the arrogant swagger he had displayed when he told me to stop bullying his daughter. He was no longer a proud, struggling businessman. He was a documented federal criminal facing decades in a maximum security prison. But the blast radius of his arrest was not confined to his own household. The meticulously gathered evidence provided by my legal team drew a direct, undeniable line between Derek's fake logistics company and the internal accounting systems of my firm. The primary conduit for that stolen money was my wife. Cynthia's situation deteriorated with a speed that was almost difficult to comprehend. The 72-hour eviction notice had already forced her out of the multi-million-dollar Boston estate. She was legally permitted to take only her clothing and her personal effects, leaving behind the custom furniture, the priceless art, and the vintage wine cellar that my holding company rightfully owned. Without access to my bank accounts, and with her supplemental credit cards completely deactivated, she found herself plunged into a terrifying financial abyss. She was forced to rent a cramped, unremarkable apartment in a distinctly average neighborhood, relying entirely on her meager, long-forgotten pension. The opulent social life she had cultivated for nearly 4 decades vanished overnight. She could no longer afford the country club membership or host lavish dinners. Her wealthy friends, sensing the toxic cloud of a messy divorce and impending criminal charges, quickly distanced themselves, leaving her entirely isolated. But the loss of her social status was nothing compared to the legal nightmare that was rapidly unfolding. Following Derek's arrest, federal investigators formally implicated Cynthia as a direct co-conspirator in the embezzlement scheme. She was facing grueling years-long legal battles that she was completely unequipped to navigate. She desperately needed a high-powered criminal defense attorney to keep her out of a federal prison cell, but top-tier lawyers require massive retainers. The infinite river of wealth she had recklessly drained for years was completely dry. She was drowning, pulled under by the heavy weight of her own boundless greed, and she finally realized that the only life raft in existence was the very man she had attempted to destroy. I was sitting on the wooden deck of my cabin watching a pair of eagles circle high above the mountain valley when my satellite phone began to vibrate against the wooden table. I looked down at the glowing screen. It was a local Boston number. I knew immediately who was calling. I did not answer it. I sat perfectly still, listening to the rhythmic buzzing of the device, waiting for the call to divert to my secure voicemail system. A few minutes later, an audio file appeared in my inbox. I pressed play, turning the volume up slightly, so the sound could compete with the rushing river nearby. Cynthia's voice emanated from the small speaker, but it was completely unrecognizable. It was not the cold, calculating voice of the woman who had ordered me out of our hallway. It was not the artificially sweet voice of the manipulator trying to lure me back to sign away my assets. It was the raw, broken sound of a person who had finally reached the absolute bottom of a dark, inescapable pit. "Harrison," she wept, her voice trembling violently, with genuine suffocating panic. "Harrison, please, you have to pick up the phone. You have to help me. The authorities arrested Derek this morning. They took everything. They are threatening to indict me. I have no money for a lawyer. My apartment is awful. Morgan will not even speak to me because her car was repossessed. Please, Harrison. I know I made terrible mistakes. I know I was cruel, but we were married for 38 years. We are family. You cannot just abandon your family like this. Please, I am begging you. Call the lawyers and tell them it was all a misunderstanding. Tell them you authorized the transfers. I will do anything you want. Just please save me." I listened to her desperate pleas, analyzing the words with the detached precision of an engineer evaluating a collapsed structure. She was not apologizing for betraying me. She was not expressing genuine remorse for attempting to declare me mentally incompetent and stealing my life savings. She was simply terrified of the consequences of her own actions. She was begging me to commit perjury, to lie to federal investigators, and to risk my own freedom just to save her from a prison sentence she entirely deserved. Even in her absolute lowest moment, her primary instinct was to use me as a shield to absorb the damage she had caused. The voicemail ended, leaving the quiet mountain air completely undisturbed. I looked at the phone resting on the table. For nearly 40 years, I had been conditioned to respond to that voice. I had allowed her to weaponize family, to extract my wealth and diminish my dignity. But the man who would have rushed to her rescue had died the moment she demanded an apology for spilled wine. I picked up the phone, navigated to the settings, and selected her contact profile. I tapped the screen, permanently blocking the number. I walked away forever. 6 months have passed since the morning I deactivated the financial life support of the people who plotted my ruin. The dust has finally settled over the wreckage of my former marriage. The divorce was finalized last Tuesday, completely ending a 38-year chapter of my life in a quiet, sterile courtroom. Thanks to the ironclad evidence provided by my hidden security cameras and the relentless expertise of my top-tier legal team, the proceedings were astonishingly brief. Cynthia attempted to fight the eviction and the asset division, pleading with the judge that she was a dedicated wife who deserved half of my estate. The judge, having reviewed the detailed forensic accounting reports and listened to the crystal-clear audio of her conspiracy, disagreed entirely. She walked away with absolutely nothing but the meager balance of her own long-forgotten retirement savings. The sprawling Boston estate, the vehicles, and every cent I had earned remained securely locked within my holding companies. She now lives in a tiny, sparsely furnished apartment, entirely stripped of the lavish lifestyle she felt entitled to. She works as a receptionist at a local real estate office, forced to earn a paycheck for the first time in 4 decades. Derek is currently awaiting a federal trial. The authorities completely dismantled his fake consulting firm, exposing a tangled web of offshore accounts and wire fraud that went far beyond the $800,000 he stole from me. He sits in a holding cell, stripped of his tailored suits and his unearned arrogance, facing a mandatory minimum sentence that will likely keep him incarcerated for the remainder of his natural life. Morgan, the niece who believed throwing a glass of wine at me was a brilliant display of dominance, was forced to move back in with her disgraced parents. Her fancy city apartment lease was terminated, and the crushing weight of her 6-figure student loans has firmly tethered her to reality. The infinite safety net she relied upon is permanently gone, leaving her to finally face the absolute consequences of her own actions. As for me, I made a profound and permanent change. I did not return to the East Coast. The noise, the pretension, and the suffocating social obligations hold no appeal for me anymore. Instead, I permanently relocated to Montana. I purchased the luxury timber cabin where I spent those first crucial days dismantling their plot. The property is officially mine, surrounded by miles of untouched pine forests and the rushing crystal-clear waters of the mountain river. I spend my mornings hiking the rugged trails, breathing in the crisp, quiet air that fills my lungs with an incredible sense of vitality. I spend my afternoons fly fishing, standing waist-deep in the cold currents, feeling completely connected to the simple, honest rhythm of nature. I am 70 years old, and for the very first time in 4 long decades, I am breathing freely. I wake up every single day knowing that my peace will not be interrupted by manufactured family drama or endless demands for financial rescues. I am no longer a silent utility. I am no longer a walking automated teller machine expected to dispense cash while accepting blatant disrespect. The heavy chain of obligation I dragged around for my entire adult life has been completely shattered. I look out over the vast, snow-capped mountain peaks from my wooden deck, holding a warm cup of coffee, and I feel a profound, abiding contentment. The fresh, cool morning breeze carries the scent of pine needles, washing away all the lingering toxicity of my past. I watch the sun rise higher into the incredibly bright, cloudless sky, illuminating the endless wilderness that now belongs to me. I finally built a foundation that will never crack or betray me. I am a man who took his life back from the brink of destruction. The hardest truth a man can ever face is realizing that his generosity is being weaponized against him. For years, I believed that providing relentlessly would earn me respect and love. I was wrong. Parasites do not respect the host. They only resent the host for making them feel dependent. Never ignore disrespect under your own roof, and never let anyone convince you that protecting your life's work is selfish. Trust your instincts. When someone shows you who they truly are, whether through a spilled glass of wine or a whispered conversation, believe them immediately and strike back without mercy. Has someone in your family ever mistaken your kindness for weakness? Did you have the courage to walk away? Share your story in the comments below. If this satisfying payback resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of justice. I will see you next time.